Jimmy Fallon dropped his interview cards mid-sentence. The sound echoed through Studio 6B like a gunshot. For a man who had mastered the art of seamless conversation for 2 decades, the silence that followed was deafening. Across from him, Julia Roberts sat frozen, her hand trembling as she held a single photograph. Her eyes, usually sparkling with that famous smile, were now pooling with tears. The audience of 240 people didn't move. The roots stopped their subtle background rhythm. Even the cameramen lowered their equipment slightly, unsure whether to keep filming. Something had just shifted in the air, something real, something unscripted, something that would change the course of this interview and leave an imprint on everyone present. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not tonight. Not during what was meant to be a light-hearted promotional appearance for Julia's new film. But when you've been in show business as long as Jimmy Fallon has, you learn that the most powerful moments are the ones you never planned for. And what was about to unfold would become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history, not because of a viral sketch or a celebrity game, but because of what happens when 2 human beings drop their public personas and connect over something that transcends entertainment. But before we understand why Julia stopped mid-interview, we need to go back to where this night really began. 3 hours before the show went live, Julia Roberts walked into Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza with the energy she always brought to late-night appearances, warm, professional, ready to promote her latest project and share some laughs with Jimmy. She'd been on The Tonight Show dozens of times over the years. She knew the rhythm. The pre-interview with the producers, the lighting check, the casual chat with Jimmy before they went live. It was a well-oiled machine, and she was a veteran of it. But there was something different about Julia that day, though no one could quite put their finger on it. Her publicist noticed she'd been quieter than usual in the car ride over. Her makeup artist mentioned that Julia had asked to be alone for a few minutes before going to hair and makeup, which wasn't typical. And when she arrived at her dressing room, she spent an unusual amount of time looking at her phone, scrolling through something, her expression unreadable. Jimmy, meanwhile, was in his usual pre-show mode, running through his monologue, checking in with the roots, doing vocal warm-ups, and reviewing his interview notes. His segment producer had prepared the standard Julia Roberts package, clips from her new film, a funny story about her kids, maybe a game or 2 if time allowed. Nothing heavy. Nothing complicated. This was The Tonight Show, after all. The goal was to entertain, to make people smile before they went to bed. What neither Jimmy nor his producers knew was that Julia had received a message that afternoon, just hours before the taping. It was from someone she hadn't heard from in over 20 years. Someone who had been searching for her. Someone whose life had intersected with Julia's in a way that even she had forgotten until that message arrived, accompanied by a single photograph that would soon be sitting on Jimmy's desk. The show opened as it always did. Jimmy's monologue landed perfectly. The audience was hot. The energy was right. When he introduced Julia Roberts, the applause was thunderous. She walked out in an elegant dress, waving to the crowd, hugging Jimmy, settling into the guest chair with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Julia Roberts, everybody!" Jimmy beamed, and the audience erupted again. "It's so good to have you back." "It's good to be here, Jimmy." Julia smiled, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. They dove into the interview. Jimmy asked about her new film, and Julia delivered charming, articulate answers. She told a funny story about her daughter that had the audience laughing. Jimmy showed a clip from the movie, and they bantered about her co-stars. It was textbook late-night television, smooth and entertaining. But then, about 12 minutes into the segment, something unexpected happened. Jimmy reached for his next note card, ready to transition into a prepared story about Julia's early career, when Julia suddenly interrupted him. "Jimmy, can I show you something?" Her voice had changed. The professional polish was gone, replaced by something raw, something vulnerable. Jimmy looked up from his cards, his talk show host instincts immediately sensing a shift in tone. "Of course, yeah, what is it?" Julia reached into a small bag she'd brought with her, something the producers hadn't even noticed during the pre-show check. She pulled out a photograph, a physical print, which in itself was unusual in an age where everything lived on phones. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held it. "I received this today," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the studio monitors. "And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since." The audience, which had been relaxed and jovial moments before, suddenly leaned forward collectively. Jimmy's expression shifted from talk show host to concerned friend in an instant. He leaned across his desk, his interview cards forgotten. "What is it?" he asked gently, his voice stripped of all performance. Julia looked at the photograph, then at Jimmy, then at the audience. For a long moment, she seemed to be deciding whether to continue. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. In television time, it felt like an eternity. And then Jimmy Fallon did something he'd never done in over a decade of hosting The Tonight Show. He stood up, walked around his desk, and sat on the edge of it, closer to Julia, the way you would sit next to a friend who needed support, not the way a host conducts an interview. "Julia, you don't have to share this if you don't want to," Jimmy said softly, abandoning all pretense of entertainment. "But if you do, we're here." Julia looked up at him, tears now clearly visible in her eyes, and nodded. "I want to," she whispered. "I need to." She held up the photograph, and the camera zoomed in carefully, respectfully. It showed a much younger Julia Roberts, probably in her early 20s, standing next to a teenage girl in what appeared to be a hospital room. Both were smiling, though the girl was clearly ill, thin, with a scarf covering her head where chemotherapy had taken her hair. "Her name was Emma," Julia began, her voice steadier now, as if sharing the story was giving her strength. "And I met her in 1991, when I was filming Sleeping with the Enemy in South Carolina." The audience was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of programs and shifting in seats had stopped. Every eye was on Julia. "Emma was 16 years old, and she was dying of leukemia," Julia continued. "Her mom wrote to the production company, asking if there was any way I could visit her daughter in the hospital. Emma loved movies, loved acting, and her biggest dream was to meet me." Jimmy's eyes were locked on Julia. His entire body language shifted from entertainer to listener, to witness. "I went to see her," Julia said, a small smile breaking through her tears. "And we spent 3 hours together. She asked me about acting, about Hollywood, about what it was like to kiss Richard Gere." A small laugh from the audience, tender and sympathetic. "She was so smart, so funny, so full of life even though her body was failing her." Julia paused, looking at the photograph again. "Before I left, she asked me to promise her something. She said, 'Promise me you'll remember that being famous doesn't matter. What matters is being kind, being real, and showing up for people.'" The camera captured a single tear rolling down Jimmy's cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. "I promised her," Julia said. "And then, 2 months later, I found out she had passed away. I carried that promise with me, but over the years, as life got busy and complicated, I'm ashamed to say I forgot about Emma. Not intentionally, but the way we forget so many moments when we're caught up in our own lives." She held up the photograph again. "This morning, I received an email from Emma's younger sister, Sarah. She found me through social media. She said that Emma had kept a journal, and in her final entry, she wrote about our meeting. She wrote about how I made her feel seen, how I sat with her not as a movie star but as a person, how I listened to her dreams even though we both knew she wouldn't live to achieve them." Julia's voice cracked. "Sarah wanted me to know that Emma's last words to her family were about kindness. About how the world would be better if everyone just showed up for each other. And Sarah wanted to thank me for showing up for her sister when it mattered most." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Jimmy reached over and gently took Julia's hand, a gesture so simple and human that it transcended the artifice of television. "Emma's sister is here tonight," Julia said suddenly, looking up at the audience. "Sarah, where are you?" A young woman in the third row stood up, tears streaming down her face. She was probably in her late 30s now, but in that moment she looked like the little girl who had lost her sister decades ago. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He walked off the stage, something hosts simply don't do during a live taping, and made his way to Sarah. The cameras followed, capturing something television rarely shows: raw, unfiltered humanity. Jimmy hugged Sarah, not for the cameras, not for the ratings, but because it was the human thing to do. Then he gently brought her to the stage, offering her his chair. Julia stood and embraced Sarah, the two women holding each other as the audience watched, many of them crying openly now. The Roots, those consummate professionals who could play through anything, sat with their instruments silent, understanding that this moment needed no soundtrack. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When they finally separated, Jimmy did something else unprecedented. He turned to his director and said, loud enough for the audience to hear, "We're going to take a moment here. No commercial. We're staying with this." Network executives watching from the control room exchanged uncertain glances, but something about the moment told them not to intervene. This was bigger than format, bigger than commercial breaks, bigger than the machine of late-night television. Jimmy pulled up another chair, positioning it so that Julia and Sarah could sit next to each other, and he sat across from them, no desk between them, no barrier, just three people having a conversation. "Sarah," Jimmy said gently, "tell us about Emma. Tell us who she was beyond that hospital room." And Sarah did. She told them about Emma's love of music, how she taught herself to play guitar even after she got sick. She told them about Emma's sense of humor, how she'd make up silly songs to make Sarah laugh when their parents were stressed. She told them about Emma's compassion, how even in the hospital, she'd befriend other patients, especially the younger children who were scared. She wanted to be an actress, Sarah said, looking at Julia. Not because she wanted to be famous, but because she wanted to tell stories that mattered. She wanted to make people feel less alone. Julia nodded, fresh tears falling. She would have been extraordinary. She was extraordinary, Sarah corrected gently. And you helped her see that. You gave her that gift in her final months. But then Sarah said something that would become the turning point of the entire night. "After Emma died, I struggled for years," Sarah said, her voice steady but heavy with old pain. "I was angry. Angry at God, at the world, at the unfairness of losing my sister when I was only 10 years old. I became bitter. I pushed people away. I convinced myself that the world was cruel and that caring about people only led to more pain." She paused, looking at the photograph in Julia's hands. "But a few months ago, I found Emma's journal. I'd never read it before. It was too painful. But something made me open it. And when I read what she wrote about you, Julia, about your visit, about how you showed up for her with such genuine kindness, something in me broke open." The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. "Emma wrote, Julia Roberts could have sent an autograph or made a quick appearance for a photo op. But she didn't. She sat with me. She asked me questions. She treated me like I mattered, like my thoughts and dreams were important even though I'm dying. That's what kindness looks like. That's what showing up means. And if I don't survive this cancer, I hope people remember that the best thing we can do for each other is simply show up, really show up, with our whole hearts." Sarah looked directly at Julia. Reading that changed my life. It made me realize I'd spent 25 years being angry instead of being the kind of person Emma believed the world needed more of. So I decided to find you. To thank you. And to tell you that Emma's kindness lives on, because you showed her what it looked like. Jimmy stood up slowly, pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was his Tonight Show pin, the one he wore every night. Without a word, he unpinned it and handed it to Sarah. "This is for Emma," he said quietly, "for teaching us what really matters." The audience rose as one, applause washing over the stage like a wave. But it wasn't the kind of applause that follows a joke or a performance. It was something deeper, something sacred. Julia and Sarah embraced again, holding each other as the photograph of Emma rested between them. Jimmy stood to the side, letting them have their moment, his own tears flowing freely now. When the cameras finally cut to commercial, Jimmy didn't move back to his desk. He stayed there, with Julia and Sarah, talking quietly, listening, being present. The show ran 20 minutes over that night. No one complained. The network received thousands of emails in the hours that followed, all saying the same thing. Thank you for showing us what television can be. That photograph of Emma now sits in a frame in Jimmy's office, next to his desk where he writes his jokes and plans his show. It's a reminder that beneath all the comedy, all the celebrity, all the entertainment, the most important thing we can do is show up for each other with our whole hearts. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Jimmy Fallon never mentioned that night in interviews afterward. He didn't need to. But those who work with him noticed something shift. He started taking more time with audience members before tapings. He'd stop and really listen when people shared their stories. He kept a notebook where he'd write down the names of people he met, people who reminded him why he does what he does. Julia Roberts sent Sarah that photograph, but she kept a copy for herself. She carries it when she travels, a reminder of a promise made to a 16-year-old girl who understood more about life in her brief time than most people learn in decades. And Sarah? She became a hospice volunteer, sitting with patients in their final days, showing up the way Julia showed up for Emma, the way Jimmy showed up for her that night on stage. Because that's what we learn when we stop performing and start being present. Showing up, really showing up, changes everything.